funny talking at a microphone and like all the lights are on and I can see everyone. Welcome everyone, thank you for coming. My name is Sonia Silbert. I'm the director of the Washington Peace Center. So happy to have you all here with these fantastic speakers to talk about such an important issue. A few logistical notes. I hope everyone's signed in at the door where Sam is sitting, holding everything down so it doesn't fly away. We'll send out video from this event as well as any follow-up events or actions that are happening, so please be sure you sign in. We are taking video, and when Direction, my coworker, comes back, she's also going to be taking photos. Is anyone not comfortable being videoed or photoed in the crowd? Oh, great. I'm going to put you everywhere then. The bathrooms are right over there. We've got snacks in the back. I think that's all the logistical things. So I just want to give you kind of a brief overview of the Peace Center and framing for the event. Yeah, come on, there's seats in the front row too, if you want to be really bold. The Washington Peace Center is a local peace and justice group. We've been working here in DC since 1963. That's our office. Feel free to take a tour. We provide education, resources, and action for those working for positive social change in a world free from oppression. And we have a long history of anti-war activism in particular, from the 70s when we were doing a lot of draft counseling, to the 80s when we were doing Latin America solidarity work, to now where we're working against the ongoing occupations in Afghanistan and Iraq. It has been, well, let's see. So we started bombing Iraq again this summer and just started bombing Syria last month. A year, almost to the day, from when the last time they were trying to bomb Syria, when we gathered in this room for another teach-in about Syria, talking about how it connected to militarism and kind of US power, and we stopped them last year. And it really seemed impossible then. We stopped them, they started bombing this year, and I think we're gathering again to talk about this because we need to be able to stop it again, and I think we have that power. As you all probably know, today's Veterans Day. Some people might be at the concert on the mall, it's okay. And this year on Veterans Day, I know a lot of us in the room, including myself, have kind of a particularly heavy heart for a number of reasons. But one that really kind of rings true today is that yesterday we found out that Thomas Young died, who was a anti-war veteran activist. He was paralyzed in Iraq in 2004 and was a tireless activist against the war for many years since then. He was the focus of the anti-war documentary Body of War, for those of you who saw that. He's a member of Iraq Veterans Against the War, one of our favorite ally groups. And it's actually the third IVAW member that has been lost in the last 6 weeks. The other two, Ethan Kreutzer and Jacob George, took their own lives in the last month. And I think that has been a really heartbreaking and maybe traumatic way to remember that war never ends for those who are directly involved in it. And that is particularly so for the people in Iraq and Syria who have been living through unending war for years, pretty much. Last week, Obama announced that he would deploy up to another 1,500 troops to Iraq, doubling the number of US troops there and costing over $5 billion. Money that obviously we could use here at home. So it feels urgent and important for us to gather together, talk about what is happening there in Iraq and Syria, and figure out how to stop the war, the next war now, And it feels like, to me, the most fitting way to honor Veterans Day. And I'll just close by saying that IVAW, their main call is for reparations and U.S. accountability for Iraqi and Afghan people, better health care, and support for returning veterans and service members, and to stop these endless wars. So I'll kind of leave that as the framing for what we'll be discussing going forward. We have two really wonderful speakers, and they're going to talk each for a few minutes, and then I'm going to ask them a few general questions, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience. And first up, we're going to have Phyllis Bennis, who's a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, where she directs the new Internationalism Project. Her books, many of which are back there and you can buy tonight, include Before and After U.S. Foreign Policy and the War on Terror, and Ending the Iraq War, a primer. Then we'll have Rama Kadaimi, who is a Syrian-American activist, membership and outreach coordinator at the U.S. Campaign to End the Israeli Occupation, and a board member of the Washington Peace Center. Thanks.
Thanks, Sonia, and thanks all of you for coming out tonight. This is a hard time. This has been a really hard week in a bunch of ways. New bombings, expansion of the bombings, the deaths that we've already heard about, the conviction of our friend Rasmia in Detroit, a great Chicago activist. It's not a good time, and I'm not even mentioning the elections. So it's been a rough time, and we really have a lot of work ahead. So when we sort of figured out how we would divide up what to talk about, we thought that I would start by talking for just maybe 10 minutes or so on the question of why is the U.S. going back to war, and what is ISIS, and who are they, and what's this sort of all about. So I think that when we look at the question of the U.S. and what are they doing, the U.S. has a big problem right now, the U.S. government. They have stayed an empire. They have remained an empire long past the time when empires were popular. And they're kind of stuck. They're kind of stuck with still being a now unpopular empire, fighting what appear to be permanent wars. And that's not easy. It's particularly not easy when your theoretical framework and your justification for everything you're doing around the world is grounded in this notion of what's called American exceptionalism, which is this notion that anything we do, any war we start, any people we kill, any lands we occupy, is all okay. Not just that it's legal because we can, rewrite law at will, but it's all good. It's good because we are good. We are different. We are better. We are the shining city on the hill. And that frame kind of shapes everything about U.S. foreign policy. And unfortunately, the propaganda has been pretty intense in this country over the last 20, 30 years, so that an awful lot of people in this country buy into that. And there is this notion, if you go back to September 11, we were hardly the first country to suffer a horrific act of terror. It is true that the events, if you take them as one event on September 11, 2001, killing almost 3,000 people at one time, that was a pretty big one. That was a pretty big act of terror, no doubt. But it was also the first major, huge act of collective terror in this country ever, as long as anybody who was then alive had ever been alive. Other countries face ongoing wars and terrorist attacks far more frequently, with far more people dying far more frequently than we do. And imagine if every country that ever suffered a terrorist attack said that the response to it could be to take the world to war, and to go to war anywhere in the world against whoever we want for as long as we want, with whatever weapons we want, wherever we want, with no limits. That's the permanent war that we claimed the right to in 9/11. And I think that I was just talking, there was a Washington Post piece the other day, I don't know how many of you saw it, a few days ago. It was an article, not a bad article, about the impact on the local Syrian opposition when ISIS had taken over a particular city where they had been fighting against the regime, and suddenly they were faced with, being militarily squelched. And the article wasn't bad, but the headline of the article is, "Major Setback for U.S. in Syria." That's the important part of it, is that it's a setback for our policy somehow. Not because of what it does to the people in Syria or in Iraq, but because of how it undermines our goals in the region. So that's how this is all being seen. We can identify this as the global war on terror 2.0. We could call it the third Iraq war. You can call it what you want, but where it's similar to the first two Iraq wars, particularly the second, is that this is still very much rooted in questions of oil, questions of military bases, power expansion. That hasn't changed. So if you look at, for example, when the U.S. started this bombing campaign, we were told this was for humanitarian purposes, and we were going to save the people that were facing starvation on Mount Sinjar, the Yazidis. This is a small group from Syria who were stuck on this mountain surrounded by ISIS. That was all true. It was a horrific situation. And there were about 150 airstrikes over those 2 days. And then all of a sudden it was announced that the Yazidis had been saved. But they weren't saved by the US airstrikes. Only 2 of those US airstrikes were anywhere near Mount Sinjar. The others were all up at Erbil, which is, wait for it, the oil center. So who saved the Yazidis? The Yazidis were saved in that instance by a Syrian Kurdish group allied with a different Kurdish group that happens to be on the US anti-terrorism list, who got up the back side of the mountain, escorted the Yazidis off safely, got them into safety inside Syria, took them around the back through about 15 miles of Syrian territory, and back into Iraq, where they could cross safely and back to safety. The US had basically nothing to do with it. But it was used as an excuse to go to war, and that humanitarian part, combined with the horror of the televised version of these beheadings, managed to shift what had been a fairly strong and very wide consensus that was up to 70% of the American people over this last year who were saying, no, we don't want a new war in Syria, we don't want a new war in Iraq. And suddenly, that was reversed. Because of the humanitarian side, to a small degree, and to a huge degree, because of the beheadings. Now, beheadings are horrific, and these were particularly horrifying because they were up close and personal right there on the web in front of people. They were also particularly horrific because they were white Americans, and that's important. This is similar to the statistics around the death penalty. The racialized character of the death penalty has far more to do with the race of the victim than the race of the perpetrator. If you kill a white person, you're far more likely to get the death penalty than if you kill a person of color, whatever race you are. So the same thing kind of happened here. These were white American journalists, privileged people, who look like us. So the fact that other journalists, Syrian journalists, Iraqi journalists, Egyptian journalists, my God, have been killed in huge numbers, this is not so urgent for us. But white American journalists made it different. It was, in fact, horrific. And it has changed everything. So who is this ISIS group? In some ways, ISIS isn't something new and different. The roots of ISIS are not in Syria first, they're in Iraq. ISIS emerged in the context of the US occupation of Iraq, just like other Islamist organizations in Palestine, and Lebanon, and other places that emerge in direct response to foreign occupation. ISIS used to be called Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. Then it was later called Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It was one of a number of militias that were fighting back against the US occupation. During the period of the so-called surge of US troops, which wasn't really as much about the US troops as it was about US money, it was a financial surge where a lot of Sunni fighters were basically bought off to support the US instead of fighting against the US. ISIS and its predecessor, the Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, lost a lot of influence. A lot of fighters drifted away. They didn't quite disappear, but they kind of drifted out of sight for a while. They reappeared in Syria in the context of the chaos that emerged with the militarization of what became quickly the Syrian civil war after the initial uprising in Syria, which Rama will talk more about. But that's sort of the origins of ISIS. There were also fights between the leadership, as there always is between political organizations, whether they're Democrats and Republicans, whether they're different versions of Islamist organizations or anything else. In this case, ISIS and Al-Qaeda leaders were battling for influence, for prestige, for power, and somewhat over some theological questions, mainly this issue of, do we establish a caliphate now and just declare it and start governing, or do we say that's something that we'll have later, and in the meantime, we just carry out guerrilla tactics, terror tactics, and we don't really try to take over territory or hold cities or govern. ISIS is governing. And that's an important distinction too. How many of you saw that Senate hearing a couple of weeks ago where Kerry came in to testify and the Code Pink people were in disrupting? And it was a very, as usual, they were great. And they were shouting, we don't need more war, we don't need more war. And when Kerry came in, he said, you know, my first introduction to Washington was in the same position as these women from Code Pink. And he named Code Pink. And he said, I know who these women are. And I know that what they have been claiming is that they want to not only stop the wars, they want the money that wars cost to be used for healthcare and education. And I thought, geez, where's he going with this? And then he got to lie number one of his testimony, which was, but I've got to tell you, and he kind of looked right at Medea and shook his finger and he said, I want to tell you that those people in ISIS, they're not providing healthcare or education for anybody. That's not true. Now, it might not be the kind of education that any of us would want our kids subjected to necessarily, but it's education, and they are governing. They have health clinics and schools, and they have driver's licenses and street cleanup crews, and they are governing major cities. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing. I think it's a terrible thing. But it is a reality that's very different than what Al-Qaeda represented. It's one of the reasons, it's not the only or even the main reason, but it's one reason why they've attracted new people. They can point to some success. They are controlling territory. So there's a bunch of other components to this. The impact on the Kurdish question is huge. One of the unspoken realities of the last 3 months of this fighting is that Iraqi Kurdistan has been increased territorially by 40%, and it now controls major oil districts, particularly in Kirkuk, that it never controlled before. So the whole sort of regional landscape has been transformed through this process. None of it for the better. Now we're going to talk more about what to do about this, what the options are, because the real question now is, what are the alternatives? But let me just leave with one last point here. I think it's really crucial that we keep in mind this notion that we learned on February 15th, on September 11th of 2001. There is never only the option of war. That's never the only choice. And when anybody says we either go to war or we let them get away with it, and since nobody wants to let them get away with it, people agree with war. That's never the case, and it isn't now. Saying that we don't want war is not the same as saying we don't want to do anything. It's saying we need alternatives to war, and they have to do with diplomacy and negotiations and humanitarian assistance and a whole range of other things. But it doesn't mean going to war.
Thank you, Phyllis, and thank you, Sonia and the Peace Center for putting this event on. I'm particularly happy to be speaking tonight, mostly because I've noticed in the past few weeks and the past few months that there is a lack of Syrian voices in so many spaces, including progressive events and progressive media. And I think it's one of our primary responsibilities to listen to Syrian voices, even if they are ones that challenge our activism and what we are doing, because so much of what we are discussing today has a direct impact on the Syrian people and their revolution for freedom and dignity And so, yeah, I'm really appreciative of that, honestly. Today, the focus is on ISIS, or Daesh, as they're called, in the middle, amongst a lot of people in the Middle East, and the U.S. response. But I also want to take us back a little, because so much today is focused on the moment, what's happening exactly at this moment, and there's very little historical context, which is problematic, I think. We forget how we get here, you know. As Phyllis pointed out, there's a lot of things that got us to the point we are. We've forgotten the Arab uprisings, what is left of them, continuing of them. We have forgotten that there's been a war in Syria for the past 3.5 years, a war where a regime has been allowed to kind of commit crimes without any sort of accountability or pressure to actually step down. And why is this a problem for us today, coming in as an anti-war activist, is looking to kind of stop wars? And I think it's important because without this context, without this discussion, we only become reactionary, which I think is not the best way to actually attain our true goal as anti-war activists, to build a world where there is no war. And so I think it's always important to be self-critical. And honestly, my talk is critical towards the anti-war movement and how we've treated Syria, because I think there's so much more we can do in order to actually bring about a place when there is no more war, and we don't have to come together in order to say, oh my God, the US is bombing another country once again. And I want to take us back to last year. As Sonia said, last year, around this time, there was a lot of activism around stopping US bombing of Syria. At that time, it was Obama's threats that he was going to be bombing the Assad regime due to the red line being crossed, his red line being chemical weapons attack. So last year, August 2013, there was the regime chemical weapons attacks in Ghouta, which killed hundreds of people. And there was a push from the administration that there was going to be war. And so we have these hands-off Syria protests that took place all across the US. Protests that, again, intentionally seem to be, we want to stop the US getting involved militarily, which I think is a good goal, but had a lot lacking in them, unfortunately. Protests that either seemed oblivious to the fact that there had already been a war in Syria, going on for the previous 2 years, that at that point had killed already 75,000 people, that from the US to its Gulf allies, from Iran to Russia, there's plenty of countries and groups that were already involved in Syria. So this idea that hands off Syria, let Syria be, let the Syrian people decide what to do with their lives, that was not what was happening at the time. And even worse, unfortunately, we had some who were fully supporting the Syrian regime and its own version of war on terror propaganda. And this was based on some sort of misconstrued sense of what anti-imperialism actually meant. And so within a few weeks, the Obama administration had made the decision to not bomb the regime. I personally think the administration was never planning on doing that anyways, but we can get into that discussion later. And Syria dropped out of the news again. And not only out of the news, but unfortunately, I feel a lot of anti-war activists also kind of dropped it. No, okay, mission accomplished. The problem is thousands of Syrians continue to be killed monthly. So by August 2014, so almost a year later, it was reported by the UN that at least 192,000 Syrians had been killed. The Violations Documentation Center in Syria reports that 105,000 of these Syrians have been killed at the hands of the regime and its militia, so more than half. As of last month, almost 10 million Syrians have been displaced. So half of the Syrian population at this moment is displaced, either internally or 3.2 million are outside the country as refugees in Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, Egypt, and Iraq. If you are Syrian, this refugee statistics is especially depressing because for so long Syria itself was home to refugees, whether they be Lebanese, whether they be Iraqi or Palestinian. And it's sad to think of the concept of a Syrian refugee, honestly. And particularly for Palestinian refugees who now are facing extra discrimination when they're trying to escape to other countries due to the bigger issue of Palestinian refugees in the region and are on the receiving end of so much repression from a regime that continues to call for support due to its supposed commitment to the Palestinian cause. And yet it seemed like after Obama last year decided not to bomb, the anti-war movement and activists kind of exhaled, okay, our job is done, yay. And again, I don't want to minimize the importance of working to ensure that the US doesn't contribute back then or now to furthering the suffering of the Syrian people. But the problem is when the war was honestly ignored by most activists, until the United States was threatening to bomb the murderous regime. It's problematic because there seemed to be a sense that, well, we only get concerned with war when the US is getting involved, which is important. We have to make sure. Our first duty is to make sure the United States does not continue its horrendous policies, foreign policies through the region. But when you're getting involved in a country that has been already experiencing war, where the US is not directly implicated in supporting the regime, what then does that mean for you, for us as an anti-war movement? And those discussions, unfortunately, were not coming, or did not really happen. And again, 1 year later, when the US is now actually bombing the country, and there has been, in that past year, very little concerted effort to ensure that the United States uses whatever influence to have to actually bring down, pressure the regime to step back and step down using non-military strategies. Again, this idea of you either go bomb or you do nothing. No, there's plenty of things that could have been done, but none of them were pursued, and none of them have been being pursued. And so we only reawaken, again, when the US starts bombing ISIS, Daesh in September. Of course, they started bombing in Iraq earlier. So what is this context that I think we need to be thinking about as an anti-war movement? Now, of course, we can spend a long time discussing this conflict, this context. You can start back, all the way back to December 2010, when Mohammed Bouazizi set himself on fire and honestly ignited protests all across the region, from Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Bahrain, and of course Syria, each with varying developments over the last 4 years. You could talk about, of course, the 2003 invasion and occupation of Iraq, the 2011 NATO intervention in Libya, the fact that the US and Israel have been pushing for war on Iran these past 2 years. If we had weeks and weeks, we can honestly go back all the way to World War I and Sykes-Picot, because I think, honestly, part of what we're seeing now is the unraveling of the state system imposed by colonial powers from that. But since we don't have all this time, though I truly think, honestly, I think we as activists need to read a lot more and read from people who are in the region as well, particularly. I do want to focus on Syria and take us back only to March 2011, when some teenagers in Daraa, a city near the Jordanian border, inspired by what they were seeing happening in other countries, wrote simple slogans calling for freedom on the walls of the city. They were arrested and tortured by the regime, and protests erupted demanding that they be freed, as well as addressing other issues and grievances, mostly economic, because the region at that point had been dealing with a severe drought, and people were just suffering a lot. The regime decides to react with force. They send tanks to the city to quell the protests, and within a few weeks, already at least 100 people had been killed. And so the reaction of the regime to these small protests causes other Syrians across the country to say, this is ridiculous, like, I don't understand. All they're doing is just some small protests. The early on, actually, protesters that have been called for the fall of the regime, they were calling for reform. So if this is how the regime is reacting to that, my God, what's going to happen if people continue pushing? And so by May, June 2011, so within a few months, the barrier of fear is crumbling across the country, and protests have spread to major cities such as Homs and Hama, eventually get to the bigger cities, Damascus, the capital, and Aleppo, which is kind of the business capital, where a lot of merchants are based. And these protests were particularly strengthened following the regime's murder of 13-year-old Hamza al-Khatib, whose mutilated body was returned to his family, showing clear signs of torture. And I think the impact, if folks think back to the impact Emmett Till's murder happened here, and those photos, that's kind of very similar to, I think, what the impact in the photos of Hamza al-Khatib's body had. And so the brutal and violent crackdown continues, and by the time, again, within a few months, at least 1,000 people have been killed, either by the Syrian army or by regime's paid thugs, which are called Shabiha. It's also around this time that we begin to see the formation of armed groups. And I wanted to stress, armed groups in the beginning were formed to protect the protesters. So protests were having every day, every week. It was decided there needs to be armed groups protecting them from regime forces. And this is also the beginning of what is now called the Free Syrian Army. And so most of these groups were made up of Syrians defecting from the army at first. So people, Syrians, like, we're not going to take this anymore. We cannot fire on non-violent protesters anymore, and started defecting. Other army folks kind of just left and gave their weapons away to others, and so slowly people built up these groups that would protect their families, their neighborhoods, their cities. And I think there's a lot of confusion about what the FSA is out there by a lot of different people.